And now for something completely different. We've been talking about deities, but we're going to get back to rituals here. There's always a big component about ritual when we need to study these types of religions. Today, we're going to be studying Tantra and sexualized ritual. Now, you may have heard the term Tantra, or as Westerners say it, Tantra, which hurts my ears. Before in popular culture, referring to people like the rock musician Sting, who refers to using Tantra to have 6-hour orgasms, or you may hear about Tantra workshops, or you may find books about tantric sex. Well, we are going to be talking about tantric sex today, but it'll look quite a bit different from what you see in those feel-good as a euphemism type of workshops and lore. If anything, I'm going to call this the feel bad tantra of tantric sex. But let's get into it. So first off, what is tantra? Well, tantra is sort of like a mode of religion, a dimension of Indic religions. We can find tantra in Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, but it's not the same in any of these religions. The best way I like to think of it is that it's Indic. It's from India. Now, a lot of folks will argue that Tantra is sort of heterodox or non-Vedic Hinduism, but there's tons of Vedic rituals and even Vedic mantras that are used in tantric practices. And in fact, Tantra was the mainstream of Hinduism for a millennia. It's arguably the mainstream of Hinduism today when you really look into what people do for, in fact, temple pujas, home pujas, use of mantras, use of mudras, or, I can't do any right now, like that one, or hand gestures and so forth, are all from the tantras, and we're going to explore all of those today. So, like I said, Tantra is a ritual mode or a religious mode that's really about ritual that becomes prominent in the medieval era from the 6th to the 13th century. It is hyper ritual. Now, I'd use this term hyper ritual quite a bit it's intensely ritualized religious practices. And then Andre Padoux uses the same term in our reading to this day. Andre Padoux is a really good guy. He died relatively recently. He's sort of a legendary scholar of Tantra. And the chapters that we read out of his book today are wonderful. In fact, his book is one of the most accessible books I've ever read on Tantra. I wish I had been able to read that when I first started studying Tantra. And by the way, Tantra is my main field of expertise in my academic life. So anyway, it's a hyper ritual mode. Rituals are all physically acted out and accompanied by mantras. So when you start seeing Tantra come in, lots and lots and lots of ritual. Now, we saw lots and lots and lots of rituals in the Vedas, but Tantras do rituals a little bit differently, as we're going to see. In fact, Tantra in a lot of texts is just called the mantrayana, the vehicle of mantras, because there are just so darn many mantras in this style of being religious. So let's do a little Indian etymology. Etymology is the study of words and word roots. Now, people will often say that Tantra is like tan from tanu, which means the body, and tra means to do or to protect. Thereby, Tantra is the method that protects the body or uses the body. Now, this is a little bit of hogwash because the root is actually tan, which means to weave. So Tantra means something like a thing you do on a loom, or when you're looking at weaving threads together to create cloth, you have two parts, the warp and the woof. Tantra is the woof. So it's like the woven threads is an actual etymology. So the warp is the length, so the long part on a loom, and the woof is the vertical. So warp, woof. The woof is the, I should have put up an image of a weaving loom. It's hard to explain just with words. Words are difficult. So this is this folk etymology of that which uses or that which protects the body. They'll say that a mantra is that which protects or uses the mind. That is equally kind of hokey. But anyway, this folk etymology is used to make a point, but it's not linguistically valid. It does make a point, however, for Tantra, not unlike Hathayoga, uses somaticized or bodified rituals. Rituals are done with the body here. So a Tantra is also the name of a book or a type of books or a genre. Tantra, I like to say when people say, what is Tantra? I say Tantra is the religion that is derived out of texts called tantras. I like to translate tantra when I translate it into English, or I translate the genre of tantric text with the word grimoire, or a book of spells. Grimoire comes from the French, which means grammaire, or a grammar of magic. So Tantra really gets started in the 6th century. Its earliest texts are Shaiva, though Buddhist texts come and expand Tantra really quickly afterward. In the 10th century, we actually do see some Jain versions of Tantra, but those are still ways off in the 6th century. So what's going on in the 6th century? We're seeing temples for the first time. Yes, so we remember that Vedic rituals did not have temples and did not have images, though they did have home shrines. Here we see images and temples. We see Tantra as the primary mode of scripture and practice for temple ritual. In fact, all forms of puja are considered to be Tantra. In fact, when you try to figure out where does puja come from, the texts you have to look to are the Puranas and the Tantras. Puja really isn't found in the epics or even in the Vedics. The rituals of worship there are really different. I'll talk about puja toward the end of this lecture. So Tantra actually also incorporates a wide range of deities and practices that can be found, that can be considered folk rituals. So sort of the rituals of the villages, rituals that are not derived from Brahmins and are not derived from the Vedic scriptures. Now, Tantra really finds its context after the Guptas begin to decline. So after the Guptas decline, like the 4th century, we see that there aren't, again, big empires in India. So this is from the 4th to the 12th century, actually more like 5th or 6th, but I'm not great with the numbers. We see about 600 or 700 years where there's just all these regional kingdoms and there's no one unifying empire. You don't see a unifying empire again until like the Muslim era around the 13th century. So this era is characterized, so when you think about the political context of these sources and these rituals, I want you to think of constantly fluctuating kingdoms that are in amazing amounts of competition. Tantra is a type of ritual practice and religion for times that are under great unease, when there's a lot of unsurety around you. So Tantra and yoga actually really developed together. In many ways, Hathayoga, that violent exertion, is an extension of Tantra. Now, in Tantra, we see that there are visualized body maps. So we get this idea of there being a subtle body or an astral body. That's not quite what's going on here. The idea in Tantra is one visualizes systems of channels and symbols and chakras, or which means just wheel, not chakra, chakra with a C. So energy centers and whatnot that one imagines, and through those imaginative exercises with that subtle body, one causes changes to oneself and to one's world. This visualized body is a network of channels, or nadi, which means rivers, networks of these rivers within the body, centers of the chakras up the central line, the central channel called the sushumna. And the idea is that consciousness and life force, or ayur or prana, are manipulated and pushed around throughout those parts of this imaginal body, with the aim of elevating the self. With Tantra and yoga, you're trying to push those energies up into the head and out into the greater consciousness. And we'll see this in ritual in just a minute. So we saw that yoga can mean a union with God or a disunion of self with the world via meditation practices. But yoga practices, as we also saw, mostly cultivate superpowers and bodily perfection via mental and physical actions. Tantra practitioners as well are often called yogis. So when you're reading in a Tantra, even though Hatha Yoga hasn't really started yet, you'll see that many of the practitioners are referred to explicitly as yogis. It'll be the word yogi is used for the tantric practitioner. Now, Tantra generally sees deities as not living outside of us, though the deities do dwell outside of the body, but the deities also live inside the body. So the pilgrimage routes, the gods, even the temples are visualized within that imaginal body. Deities from the outside are installed inside the body where they will come to live. Tantra makes extensive use of visualization. Folks will visualize entire rituals, but they will also be performing physical actions. So the idea is you're doing the ritual in your head, even while you're doing the ritual externally. Some folks will actually say they just do the rituals in their heads, but usually you see that people are doing all sorts of internal practices in addition to external practices, which is something we didn't see in the Vedas. So folks will visualize whole rituals internally, but they will also perform physical rituals while visualizing. Meditation is usually a visualized ritual. There's very little like blank emptiness meditation here. When you're meditating, you're going through ritual procedures in the imaginal body. Okay, so most tantric rituals, in fact, are dualistic, arguing that there is a real world out there and that there are gods that are separated from the humans, from humanity and from man, but one can aspire to be like a god or transact with a god. Some schools posit a notion of non-duality, but these schools are in the minority, despite the fact that many scholars and practitioners write extensively about non-duality being the key to Tantra and the key to Indian religions. Now, when you do have notions of non-duality in Tantra, and remember, this is not found in the majority of Tantras, but in some there are. When you do see a Tantra that posits non-duality, they will argue that all of life and all of the world and all of subjectivity is thought to be the play of consciousness. And it is the goal to see oneself as essentially consciousness and at one with the world. While these non-dualistic philosophies may have the grace of God or devotion to God as causing realization, still the vast majority of Tantra practice is ritual. In fact, many practices that were originally considered Tantra are not considered Tantra, like puja. I've said that a couple of times. So let's think of it this way. And this is an argument out of a school of thought called Kashmiri Shaivism. They say that God was the only thing that existed. And God, out of sheer joy, for the same reason that you find yourself whistling when you go out to get the mail, or you feel yourself just so filled with happiness on certain days that you find yourself singing and dancing. Out of that reason, God said, you know what? I'm going to become the world. So he becomes the world. He manifests the world out of himself, and the whole world is a transformation of him. But he still knows he's God. So he is the world, and he is the humans in the world, but he still knows he's God. So he thinks, you know what would be really cool? I am going to forget that I am God in order to have the joy of finding myself again. Out of this tantric school, our goal is to remember our essential truth that we are God who has manifested this entire universe, and that God is essentially just pure consciousness and pure light, slowed down to create this world. And our goal is to realize that essential truth. And when we realize that, we realize there is no pain, there is no suffering, and we are all that we see. All that we think is all that we are. And in fact, everything around us is just the play of thought and consciousness, which is a very sexy, cool idea. I've always been kind of fond of it myself. I have a little addendum to that. And I'd say that God sort of got good at finding himself again and remembering who he was through this process of becoming the world and becoming humans and forgetting himself. So at a certain point, he realized, I'm going to get really dumb because I want to take the time to really remember myself. So this would mean when you meet someone who's not so bright or is really stupid or is forcefully ignorant, you should be impressed because that person was probably liberated relatively recently and God decided to come back just dumb as a bag of doorknobs. That's one of my little things I like to talk about. So for Indians and for Hindus in general, women are a problem, and we'll see this throughout when I start talking about tantric sex and tantric practices that surround sexuality. So women are a problem. For women might be a source of power. Women are Shakti, but in fact, when you have sex with women, you lose your, and you being male, because this is a patriarchal male system, you lose your semen, and semen is essential to your virility, your hero status, your very energy. So what we see here is if you lose a lot of semen in this system, you will age prematurely. So there's a thing called Gupta Rog, which means the secret illness or semen loss, that says that an extensive loss of semen through masturbation or sex causes a man to age quickly and in fact die young. In fact, when a man dies very young and he's married, his wife is often thought to have exhausted his health through excessive ejaculation, through excessive sex with him. Talk about a raw deal. I mean, what are you going to do? In yoga and tantra, as we will see, the retention and transmutation of semen causes immortality, spiritual development, and spiritual power. In this sense, if you retain the semen, doing specific yogic powers, pushing them up through the body, as I've said, putting them into the head, then they will rain down as nectar. So semen you keep in your body makes you strong and powerful. Semen you cast out of your body means losing your power. There is some speculation that something like this works with women concerning uterine blood or vaginal secretions, but I mean, we can really only speculate. These texts are really about dudes and they're really about semen. So some tantric rituals involve ritual transgression. This is something that comes up often when you talk about tantra. They talk about the 5 M's, which I'll talk about in just a second, which are 5 substances that are considered improper. And the idea is that in tantric ritual, you consume these impure substances, and by doing that, you in fact gain power because you realize that they are in fact pure. So what are some of these impure things? Well, mixing different castes, consuming meat, consuming booze, sexualized rituals, and so forth. The 5 M's are in fact mansa, which is cow flesh or maybe human flesh, matsya or fish, maituna, which is ritual copulation, madhu, which is booze and liquor, and of course mudra, which is not like the hand gestures, but mudra is mudra means probably parched kidney beans. The kidney bean is considered to be a very kind of sort of sexually potent thing. You might see that I keep doing this. Now, I know we have this notion in contemporary Western culture that this means A-OK or it's a white power symbol. But in India, it's a very potent symbol that is like, it shows the truth of the cosmos. And the idea is man and God are one, and there is one. And outside of man and God are the 3 gunas. So it's Purusha and Prakriti. Another great mudra is this one, the Abhaya mudra, which means it has no fear. And then there's another one like this or like this, which is I'm granting or giving you something. Or there's this mudra, which is to worship or to make offering. So when I'm talking about these powerful substances that are supposedly inherently impure, you got to remember they're only really impure for a Brahmin. If you're a kshatriya, if you're a warrior, having meat, drinking liquor, having a lot of sex, these aren't impure in any way. They're perfectly acceptable for a kshatriya. So we got to remember that it's not, in fact, like Brahmins would argue that these things are impure, but the truth is these are powerful substances. Alcohol, meat, and sex is considered to be very powerful. So consuming these and these impure things or these powerful substances in the rituals makes you more powerful. So they're not powerful, in fact, because they're impure, because they're only impure to one group of people. In fact, they're not made powerful because you violated purity rules. They're powerful because they are inherently powerful. So one way my advisor, David White, would always say is that tantric sex or tantric ritual is a sexualization of ritual, not a ritualization of sex. So we'll talk about a tantric sexual ritual in just a second. What I mean by a sexualization of ritual, not a ritualization of sex, is that one acts out Vedic ritual, almost Vedic rituals in a bodily way. So the penis becomes the ladling spoon, the vagina becomes the fire. Obviously, what is the butter and the ghee going to be that you pour into there? It's going to be semen. So sexualization of ritual. You're still doing ritual, but in a sexual way. This isn't a ritualization of sex. You're not having sex to have an orgasm or to connect with your partner and making a ritual out of it. You're acting out ritual in a sexualized manner. Let's talk about some key terms in Tantra real quick. So mantras. Mantras are spoken spells or ritual invocations. They sometimes have a semantic meaning like Om Namah Shivaya, which means I bow to Shiva. Others will have these little like seed syllables that don't mean anything like Om Shrim Hrim Krim Bum Hum Pate. Like that's a mantra that comes up a lot in the tantras. So it could simply mean I bow to Shiva, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Or it could be Om Shrim Krim, Om Shrim Krim, Om Hrim Shrim Krim Bum Hum Pate. So one has meaning and one doesn't, but by doing them, you are activating worship or causing a change in the world. Nyasa means installment or the settling down. Here you take a mantra or a syllable out of a mantra and you place it onto the body, and usually accompanied by a mudra. So it'll be like toink, and you'll be like, Om, Hrim, Shrim, Di, Ro, Gya, Bha, Om, Bu, Ba, Fa, Swa. So this is actually the Gayatri mantra that says Om, Bu, Bhuva, Swa, Tat Savitur Varehen Yam Pargo Devasya Dimahi Dyo Na Prachodayat. It's kind of all over the place, but that's a really common mantra, and it's been installed on the body in that way. This isn't a random thing. You don't just point to your body and put the like little mantric things in there. It's a setup system. What about mudras? So here are some mudras. A mudra actually means a seal, or it's a hand gesture. It's used in ritual and meditation. It's thought that you say the mantra, then you do the mudra, and then that causes the mantra to be sealed and proper. Now, this word mudra is also a word for meditation. You have the term mahamudra, which means a powerful non-dual meditation. You could also see the word mudra used to refer to sexual union in ritual. So the sexual union between a penis and vagina is called a mudra, a seal. I think you can work that out on your own, how that would operate. Yantras. So these are sort of mystical diagrams. The word actually means machine. So a yantra is used to visualize the body of a deity or to perform a magic spell. So when you would look at this mantra or this yantra right here, you would see this is actually being sort of a non-human formed or a non-anthropomorphic form of a deity. Also, you'll draw these types of yantras, and you can use them in rituals to confer a magical effect of one kind or another. A word that you may have heard that's related to this is mandala, which just means circle, which mandala and yantra can also refer to the ritual space in which one performs a tantric ritual. Kundalini, the bent one. This is this coiled serpent power that is female and is considered to be within all of us. It is coiled up around at the base of our bodies near our navels, and either by the power of spiritual practice or by the grace of a guru, the snake awakens and it rises up the central channel, up through the head, all the while breaking up all your bad karmas and obstructions and conferring liberation and magical powers. The snake runs up your spine and it causes incredibly potent effects. Remember, over and over again with Tantra and with yoga, the goal is to raise the energies up and out. Now, I talked to you before about the tantric body, or the visualized inner body structure, or the imaginal body. This is the physical spiritual body that is characterized by flows, or nadi, which also means river, of energy, or prana, which means life force, energy, or winds, or even breath. So you have prana that is pushed through the nadis. And then in that subtle body, you also see wheels, chakra. So a chakra is a wheel or an energy center, and you can read about them. Sometimes there's 6, sometimes there's 4, sometimes there's 9. There's always a whole bunch of them. If you hear anybody say there are only 7 chakras, call BS on them, because they're different in almost every system. There's also these things called bandhas, which means like a lock. So you would lock your breath or lock energy in a specific place to either expand that spot or to cause some effect in the body. Now, the more energy you have and the more that it flows, the greater spiritual liberation or power you can get. So folk will often call this subtle body, the subtle body, which means sukshma sarira. But this is a little confusing because you also have a subtle body, or sukshma sharira, that goes from life to life, that you take from your one life to your next life. So it's better to think of this as sort of the visualized inner body structure, or the imaginal body. Now, we've seen the term yoga before. Yoga means union, but that union can refer to many things. Maybe that union is man and God. Maybe that union is soul and nature. Maybe that union is a horse and a carriage, or maybe it's disunion. Because when we really notice, when we really look at yoga, it's separating nature and the soul. So the earliest versions of yoga that we found in Patanjali posits methods to unite the soul and sort of the soul and the wider. It's hard to really say with Patanjali. I'm just going to let that idea go. So remember, Hatha Yoga means the violent exertion. This evolves along with Tantra, and I would actually argue that Hatha Yoga comes out of Tantra. It is a physical type of religious practice that is performed by ascetics. Mostly, it is meditation with a few body positions held for long periods of time to manipulate the body and to gain magic powers and bodily perfection. It is only somewhat related to modern postural yoga, which we see in yoga studios everywhere today. So what is the earliest of tantras, the earliest part of tantras? Here I want to talk about two types of figures. Kapalikas, the ascetics who are bearers of skulls. That perform a certain type of ritual that I'll talk about in a second. And yoginis, these animal-headed witches that fly through the air, and that if you contact them properly, you'll become their darling and they'll give you magic powers. But if you contact them improperly, they will devour you. You will either be their darling or you will be their dinner. Look out, you don't want to be their dinner. So Tantra can be divided in sort of two stages. One is earlier than the other, but the second doesn't exactly replace the first. They both kind of continue to exist up to this day in many ways. So the first group I want to talk about are the Kapalikas, the skull bearers. They wander around cremation grounds and to ambivalent, dangerous, and impure places. All the while they're going to these dangerous places, they're looking for power. How are they looking for power? Well, in these dangerous places like these abandoned temples, cremation grounds, and mountaintops, they're able to invoke and call down animal-headed witches known as yoginis. Now, a yogini can just be considered somebody who does yoga and pure grammar, but generally when they refer to yoginis in India and in Hinduism, it's these animal-headed witches. So when you hear a woman talking about how she's a yogini because she goes to a yoga class at the YMCA, try not to giggle too hard. Anyway, so these Kapalikas interact with those witches by making offerings and sometimes having sexual interactions with them. When they have sexual interactions with them, they consume the commingled sexual fluids from intercourse, which would be vaginal blood, because generally the ideal time to perform tantric sexual engagements is when a woman is in her menses, and semen. These commingled sexual fluids become a potent nectar, a powerful ambrosia that is, when consumed, is able to create magical powers, to lengthen life, to confer bodily immortality, and maybe, just maybe every now and then, confer liberations. So these guys, and they're all guys, there are no female Kapalikas, are renunciates. They've left their homes in search of power, and one of the ways they get power is through transacting with these terrifying entities. So there was not actually a group or an order just called the Kapalikas. Kapalikas are, again, another mode of religiosity. So there's a whole bunch of groups of sort of renunciates that would take on the Kapalika vow, which is to dress in a certain way, wearing bones, covered in ash, bearing forth skulls. So they get a really scary way of looking about them. They also carry a fair amount of weaponry, so don't mess with Kapalikas. So Kapalikas, as I just said, are a mode of religiosity. People take up the vow to maintain this appearance and do these practices. So my advisor, David White, would often say on this, just because somebody rides a Harley on the weekend doesn't mean they're a Hell's Angel. Just as it means that somebody might take up the vow to be a Kapalika, but not necessarily be a Tantrika. So I like to think of these, using another term by a scholar named Alexis Sanderson, as a cult of exorcistic visionaries. This is hardcore Tantra. They're out there consuming terrifying substances. They're out there getting intoxicated to have altered states of consciousness, to interact with animal-headed witches who may or may not be physically present, or you may encounter them inside yourself or even in another dimension. Maybe they're even UFOs, who knows, swooping down to interact with you, which is an argument that's been made by one or two scholars. But who are these yoginis? These yoginis are witches and women. Now, they could either be initiated female practitioners of Tantra, who someone would engage in tantric ritual with, or do yoga, or they can be these animal-headed flying witches. Even if they are the human types, they would be drawing on the imagery, maybe even pretending that they are these scary animal-headed witches. Now, when you look to a yogini temple, and here's one at the bottom of the picture, you'll see that there's a sequence of often 64 yoginis. They're thought to be in groups. They're animal-headed. They have temples with no roofs because they are considered to fly. You can't have a roof on the temple because you go and you do the offerings, and they're thought to swoop down from the skies, and you meet them, and hopefully you'll be their darling and not their dinner. However, in some of these temples, we actually find that there's sort of like hidden passages and secretive doorways. So we could imagine that these practitioners would be like imagining doing their rituals and like they're doing their whole thing, trying to invoke the yoginis. And a physical woman who's pretending to be a yogini, or who in fact is a yogini in physical form, could sneak in through those passageways and interact with these tantrika practitioners. So yoginis are dangerous, but the substances that you can get from them, their menstrual blood commingled with semen that are derived from erotic interaction, are essential for tantric development. Those substances, in some texts as well, are considered to be Gnostic transmissions. Those commingled sexual substances are thought to confer the sort of good stuff that will give you Gnostic revelation. From consuming those and interacting with them sexually, you will gain the wisdom that it takes to become liberated. In this sense, the medium is a bit of the message. The second group I want to talk about, this sort of somewhat later group, but I would say co-evolved group. They're later, but they're still around. These are people you can encounter today, are sort of householder tantrikas. I like to think of this as like being softcore tantra. There was hardcore tantra, where you're interacting with these crazy beings, and there's softcore tantra, where you're kind of doing a lot of imagining and philosophizing. So these fellows still use all the symbolism of the Kapalikas, but they internalize that practice. They internally summon the witches and interact with them. They may consume dangerous substances physically, but more often they will just imagine and visualize themselves doing the rituals and consuming the dangerous substances. This becomes really popular because there's a much lower buy-in. You don't have to dress up in ashes and wear a skull and go out in the middle of the night and hopefully run into a scary deity who might kill you. You can just get into the right mode, stance, and trance and perform this in a temple or in your home. You don't have to consume these impure substances. You can just visualize yourself doing this. The yoginis, in this sense, become the rays of cognition instead of witches or goddesses. The yoginis dwell in your senses instead of being actual entities you interact with. This is very much deodorized or anesthetized tantra. It was acceptable because all of the tantra technologies were still used without performing the more troubling aspects of tantra physically. Now, I want to talk about a tantric meditative ritual. So one meditative ritual that sort of works out a lot of these themes is found in the writings of a guy named Abhinavagupta and it's fun to say, Abhinavagupta. He lived in 10th century Kashmir, and he was probably one of the greatest exponents of non-dualistic tantra. His work is some of the best philosophical work in tantra. It's steadily being translated. I find it very difficult to understand the Sanskrit of it because he was also sort of an aesthetician. So he was really into like drama and music and whatnot, but he was also doing tantric rituals. It's actually thought to be that he was born from a tantric sexual ritual between a yogini and his father, in which she became pregnant. We'll talk about that tantric sexual ritual in just a second. He had a conception of tantra as being non-dualistic, so he was always trying to find the reduction of man and God, world and individual, the senses and the sense objects as being reduced to a single point that would overwhelm the consciousness and bring forth a liberative vision that would take one and make them into someone who is living, who is still alive and living while liberated, called Jivan Mukti, one who is liberated while alive. Whereas most people, if they're going to get liberation in Tantra, it's thought that the liberation comes after their death. So let's look at one of these preliminary rituals. First, one performs nyasa and purifies the body. The body is visualized as being burned up and completely fused with Shiva, and Shakti. This is a Shiva system. The body is worshipped, and it is seen that the body is Shiva and that consciousness is Shiva. Next one visualizes a trident starting at one's navel and going up out through one's forehead. Now, directly above one's forehead is the body of a corpse of Shiva, Shiva as a complete corpse. And then above that is the trident, the three forms, and you see three goddesses there. You have Para, and Apara, who are all seated on yet another dead Shiva. But this Shiva is a Bhairava. The three of them are also thought to be Kala Samkarshini. Kala Samkarshini is the fire that permeates and destroys the entire cosmos, but cannot be visualized. So you have this incredibly powerful set of three deities that rest atop those points. And it's thought that every level of the cosmos and all of existence can be found along the axis of the trident, and then by going up and visualize yourself moving through the whole cosmos, and then up and then fusing with those three deities, one is able to realize that one's body is the entire cosmos, that your consciousness is cosmic, and that by fusing with those deities that are up there, you're moving your consciousness out and fusing it with all of consciousness and pervading all of the world. I actually know a guy who does this ritual all the time. It's weird. The tantric insight here is that visualization, mantras, which are used at every stage of this worship, multiple deities, and all of this ascent of consciousness fuses the consciousness to those deities that are considered to be even non-dual, fuses oneself with everything. So how does this work out in a sexual ritual? Now, like I said, Tantra really starts with sexual rituals, sort of hardcore Tantra, in which yogi heroes sport with these yogini witches to gain the potent potent sexual substances that confer magical powers. Well, tantric sexual rituals were also performed in a less dangerous manner. And I'm once again talking about, I'm paraphrasing Padoux here. So some basic rituals that were also sexual involved yoni worship, which would be vagina or vulva worship, in which the yogi worships his consort, his sexual partner. Remember, we never see anything talking about the woman's agency here. A woman is merely an object. A woman is a means to an end in the ritual. There is nothing that is feminist in Tantra. There is nothing that glorifies women as women. There's plenty that glorifies women as symbols of Shakti, but that is something to own or to possess, not something to be considered your equal or to have a relationship with. All right, so remember, Tantra is patriarchal. So anyway, in vagina worship, the yogi will worship his consort as a goddess, and then he has sex with her and gathers and consumes the sexual fluids. These fluids are thought to be the essence of the god and goddess channeled through physical bodies. Now we have Abhinavagupta again describing an elaborate sexualized ritual that is representative of a lot of tantric practices. And I'll just read through this with you. The practitioner first must be a perfect hero, a virya. His kundalini, that cosmic serpent, must be activated and fully uncoiled. He must have incredible mental focus, so he's been practicing his dharana, so he can be one-pointed in his thinking, and he has full control of his sexuality and sensuality. Now, there is an orgasm in this ritual, but it must happen at a very specific time, and the orgasm is not about simple pleasure. His consort must also be of firm mind. They say, oh, she's also very, she's very good looking and blah, blah, blah. She has one-pointed concentration, but, her role is never really explained. So the setting is a well-adorned and decorated palace or place. He consecrates everything that is to be used in the ritual and the whole space that the ritual will be done with mantras, and then he lays down a special cloth that's marked with mystical diagrams. All the while, he's visualizing himself as God and chanting mantras. He holds his consort, his physical partner, close to him, and he worships her. Steadily, they alter each other's consciousness through initial kissing and fondling and imagining their bodies and their whole consciousness is dissolving into pure pleasure. into bliss, which isn't quite the same as pleasure. Bliss is like a fullness of being. So he then worships her yoni, he worships her vulva, and he enters her. And they commingle their sexual fluids after orgasm. Her orgasm is never talked about. Then they gather the sexual fluids up, put them in their mouth, and pass them back and forth as they're kissing. The woman's likely menstruating at this time. Now, a child who's born from this ritual is thought to be very special, and a bit of a Gupta was thought to be born from just such a ritual. They mix these powerful fluids then with alcohol and offer it to the deities, and then they drink it themselves. This is considered nectar, that is considered pure consciousness. The nectar is thought to do a few things. One, it's transgressive. These are dangerous substances, but it's also a powerful substance. It's also considered to be the body and consciousness of all the deities. In all these practices, folks are thought to rise up to the gods. The gods don't reach down. Your goal is to go up and become like the gods. Finally, they rest in bliss. Soon, they conclude with a practice of mantra repetition. They do another yoni worship and do another sexual union in which the minds and powers of the practitioners unite and interpenetrate, and they fuse with the consciousness of the divine. It is thought that this very ritual will cause liberation while living. Now, this is a long and involved ritual, and it's heavily, well, sorry, sorry about that. I got too far behind myself. So they rest in bliss. The idea is that these long, complicated rituals are done for specific ends. There's no description of orgasm. The goal is gaining powerful substances and maintaining meditation and expanding consciousness. The female position here is never described. It's all about the male in this description. While this ritual is described to bring liberation, the vast majority of sexual rituals that are done in Tantra are performed to gain supernatural powers. Furthermore, these sexual rituals are not a big deal. Well, they are a big deal, but they're not found in a lot of tantras. A lot of people just will say that Tantra is all about the sexual rituals, but when you look at a lot of tantras, there aren't a lot of sexual rituals in them. I wanted to describe this final ritual that Shaman Hatley wrote about called the Asidara Vrata. Now, this is an interesting argument that he's brought up recently. This means something like the sword practice or the razor's edge practice. This practice is found in some of the earliest of the tantras, and Hatley demonstrates that it has roots in either Brahminical that it does have roots in Brahmin rituals that are used to encourage celibacy. Anyway, it was originally performed as a means to cultivate restraint of the senses while engaging in sexual activities. But it is in fact redirected in later tantras to confer supernatural powers. So early tantric sexual practices are varied because tantric sex is not any one thing, despite what Neo Tantra says. Practices include performing love magic to get a partner. So I do a magic ritual to attract a partner or make a partner love me. Love magic to attract a yakshini or a yogini, to get one of these scary deities to come down and give you magical powers. Orgasmic sexuality, and then manipulating the fluids. Erotic practices that are done in large group rituals. Sexual initiations, in which there are some ways that you get initiated into a tantric order that will involve ritual copulation. Meditative sexuality, and Vajroli Mudra, the fountain pen technique, which involves urethral suction. The idea here being that a man is able to use a yogic power to draw his semen back after he ejaculates, once it's been combined with feminine sexual fluids, into the body. Then it's transmuted, pushed up the spine, yada, 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 yada. Anyway, so from this partial list, we see that there are all sorts of ways to do tantric sex, and it's not one thing. But the Asida Vrata, or the Asidara Vrata, is earlier than those rituals that collect and manipulate sexual fluids. Like I said, it's derived from a ritual practice in which a man stimulates his desire, but does not culminate in orgasm. This is the first documented tantric sexual ritual, according to Hatley, I'm not sure on this, from the earliest level of the text. Thus, the first ritual involving sexual contact is non-orgasmic, is not about sexual fluids, and is not about orgasm. It involves placing the penis upon the vulva, not inside the vulva, and engaging in careful meditation and mantra, and not losing or spilling the seed. And if one ejaculates doing this practice, it's considered a mortal sin. There's no discussion of any type of pleasure or practice for the woman. As with so much of Tantra, the woman's body is not just an object or a means to the ends. We do see later versions of this razor's edge effect that does involve vaginal penetration, but there's no orgasm. Now, I will note that if you look into Buddhist Tantra, a lot of the practices are really similar to this and that they're non-orgasmic and just in generally resemble this early technique. So the results of all of these practices are come from mastery of mantras and attaining power. Let me say that again. When you read the results sections on this razor's edge or sword practice, or what we would now call edging techniques, the ultimate result of it would be to gain mastery of the mantras. You'd be chanting all the mantras while you're doing this, and then suddenly the mantra would become alive and would work really well. Or you would suddenly gain a magical power. It wouldn't be gaining liberation. So in contrast to Neo Tantra, which I will talk about in a second, there is no talk of healing, nor is there a talk of an altered state of consciousness, like we saw in the sexual ritual I just talked about. That might bring about Gnostic attainment. All right, puja. Let's get away from sex. So tantric puja aims to connect the practitioner to the deity he worships. This is unthinkable in Vedic ritual. But all the elements of this puja actually inform later practices of pujas in temples and in homes. The practitioner, in fact, purifies their body and imagines a divine body. This is the first preliminary, is to purify your body and imagine that it is a very body like God's. Once purified, the practitioner infuses himself with Shakti, or that feminine power, and becomes the God in order to worship the God. You are to see the God as yourself and yourself as the God. The deity is then imagined in the heart, and one performs doing an inner worship. You create a throne within the body, install the deity there, and fix it there using mantras and mudras. Then you internally offer such things as bathing the deity, anointing the deity with sort of like perfumes and unguents. You dress the deity, you put jewelry on the deity, you give the deity food, give it incense, offer it lights. These are often called the 16 actions for worship. Then one dwells facing the deity. So you imagine you're facing the deity and perform a liquid offering, usually an offering, you'd be visualizing an offering of ghee or butter or whatnot. And then, then you would perform mantra recitation, and then you would bid the deity farewell. After doing all of this, then you do the exact same thing externally in a temple or in front of an image. I would venture that people were internally doing this and then decided to do them externally. Or do you think that this was an external style of worship that people then began visualizing and then began saying that you need to visualize it and doing the actual worship? It's hard to say. I'm not sure. All right. The final points I wanted to make are about diksha or flower, or diksha or initiation. There are two forms of main initiation here in Tantra. And the first one performs a whole bunch of mantras and whatnot and gets into sort of an altered state of consciousness. The guru guides you to do this. Then you're blindfolded and he gives you a flower. You throw the flower down onto one of those mystic symbols like I have there. And depending on what triangle it lands on, that becomes the specific goddess that you're going to worship in your practice, and your guru would give you instruction in that. There's also a type of initiation called Shaktipat, or the descent of power. In this, by the guru's gaze, touch, wiggling of a feather across your face, or even touching you, it causes the deity to flow through the guru and into you. So it's initiation by causing the deity to enter you. Finally, what is sex magic in Neo Tantra? Well, there's a whole lot of talk about Tantra and what they call Neo Tantra, which is new Tantra, which is no Tantra at all. But when you hear Tantra or Tantra described in Western culture, this is what they're talking about. And it actually has its roots, this Neo Tantra has more of its roots in what we call sex magic rather than what you would find in any Indic source. So in the colonial era, when the British controlled India, they depicted Tantra as being about transgressive sex, black magic, and just plain hedonism. Some of that's in there, but a lot of it isn't. But starting in the late 19th century and the 20th century, a wide range of Europeans and Americans began to experiment with using sexual experiences, leading to Gnostic experiences. These were usually done in the context of marriage, at least by Pascal Beverly Randolph. The guy on the right is Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was half Black. He was an American. He died under suspicious circumstances. All of his works were considered blasphemous and horrible and were censored. But he posited what I would just plain straight up call sex magic. And in this, a husband and wife, and he was always talking about a husband and wife, it was only in the context of marriage, would engage in sexual actions, trying to focus their willpower on a specific end or a specific result or specific desire. And then at the instant of mutual orgasm, they would let that thing that they were focused on completely dissolve in the energy of the orgasm. And it's thought that that would change the world. This is not found anywhere in any Tantra, in anything that's Indian at all. However, if you look into any of this Neo Tantra, you'll find this idea all over the place. So as the 20th century moved on, many folks started to think about psychosexual healing and sexual liberation. Now, when I mean psychosexual healing, that means that orgasms can heal the body or can resolve interior psychological traumas. Again, none of that is found in Indian Tantra. So let's say starting in the 60s, people started looking at like early Tantra translations and depictions of deities copulating and argued that these Asian artifacts were expressions of sexual magic, such as Pascal Beverly Randolph set forth, and free love notions from the 1960s. Notably, what they did was they layered Western ideas about sex and sexuality onto a non-Western context and ran roughshod over Indian Tantra that would be considered the most pure version of religion. To Hindu Tantrikas. So contemporary Neo Tantra or New Tantra, contemporary Neo Tantra or New Tantra is cloaked in the East, but in fact is really a Western project masquerading as Asian. I think you will struggle to find concepts discussed today in any discourse on Neo Tantra. You will not find any resolutions of sexual trauma or sexual healing, filling the consciousness with erotic bliss, extending mutual sexual pleasure for hours, multiple orgasms, or making all interactions with the world into sexual ones. You will not find that in Indian Tantra. You'll find it all through Neo Tantra, and they'll say it comes from India, but it just plain doesn't. All this is to say, it's fine. If you want to do this stuff, it's fine. If you want to have crazy orgasms and have sexual workshops and do sexual healing and whatever, that's fine. But it ain't Tantra. Don't call it Tantra. I was actually having dinner one time with a guy and his wife who do sort of what they call a tantric healing and sexual prostate massages they were talking about. And the guy pounded his arm on the table and said, people don't understand. Tantra doesn't come from India, it comes from California. And I said, you are absolutely correct, sir. Thank you. That is the actual point. So all this is fine, but it ain't Indian, it ain't Hinduism, and it ain't Tantra. All right. So for our next class, we're going to talk about the 6 ritual results. So we're going to talk about magic. Now, Tantras have a wide system of magical rituals that confer pragmatic, this worldly results. Their goal is to gain magical powers or to cause changes in the world through rituals. And we see that these types of contents, these magical rituals, are far more pervasive. And there's way more of them than any of the sexual rituals than you found in the Tantra. So we talked a lot about tantric sex today because people have become obsessed with tantric sex. But when you really look into the Tantras, there ain't all that much sex in it. And there's very little that's all that sexy. So that's the end. I hope you had a fun time with this today. I will catch you on the next side. We're going to talk about magic, which is my personal favorite thing in the world.